All right, thank you. And you can all hear me? Perfect, cool. Yeah, so we're going to talk about building cloud security programs and my experiences I've had in the past doing that. We'll start with a disclaimer. I grew up in the media and entertainment space. We don't have a lot of compliance regulations. So this disclaimer is very important if you do live in the regulated space, that your mileage may vary. So who am I? I've been doing IT now for about 25 years. Started doing cloud around 2014, actually really 2010, but didn't get back into it for another few more years. Moved into security in 2017. Built the cloud security programs now at 3 companies. I'm starting on my 4th now. Founder of the Forward Cloud Sec Conference, one of those. We're sort of a B-sides to the AWS Reinforce event. And I do rant a lot on Twitter or Mastodon or Twitter, depending on what my mood is. So agenda, we'll talk about how I did this, how I build a cloud security program, general challenges in cloud security. That might be a little bit of a therapy session, so indulge me. And then I was asked, we don't have a lot of talks here on what works, what doesn't, what's a waste of time. So we're going to cover those 3 things. And then lastly, I want to talk about what I want to do different next time. My thinking around, okay, I've tried these things, they didn't work great, or they did work. What do I want to try differently? All right. So when you look back into the dark ages of cloud security, we'll say about 9 years ago, we kind of knew there were some threats out there, but we didn't really know what to do about them. So one of the first AWS talks at a security conference was, pivoting in the Amazon cloud in Black Hat. And it was a nifty little thing. It was like, hey, he did something that we all know about, server-side request forgery. Boom, he got creds. And then he talked about what to do with those. And that was kind of the first time that we all saw that credential exfiltration through network-based attacks was a thing. So we knew there were problems back then. But cloud security posture monitoring was in a very immature state. In fact, I don't think they had even come up with that acronym at that point. 2016 saw the first CIS benchmark for AWS. Scout 2 from the NCC group had come out just a few years before that, but it really didn't do much more than say, hey, you have a security group open to the world. Other tools had started coming out, but they weren't really enterprise focused. At that point, I had about 100 and so accounts. And the vendor was telling me, okay, go into our console and click here and set up your account. Well, that's great, but that doesn't work at an enterprise scale. In fact, one vendor was so bad, they gave me a PDF file. And that PDF file had some JSON IAM policies. And they were like, oh, just cut and paste this and put it into the AWS console. And I'm like, have you all heard of CloudFormation? So that was how I kind of got started with the security team. Is I was on the operations side being told to do these horrible things. And I'm like, no, here's a CloudFormation template. I handed it off to the security team, told them to share it with everybody else in the company. But that's sort of where we were back then. So my journey, as I said, started doing cloud stuff in 2014. And I really got into it because, holy cow, infrastructure as code is awesome. I can replace the engineer that takes 6 months to run fiber from one end of the room to the other with 16 lines of JSON. That was my epiphany moment in reInvent. And then a few months later, YAML support came out, and those 16 lines of JSON became like 8 lines of YAML. When I joined the security team, our focus was we had bought a CSPM. I didn't get a choice in buying the CSPM, but now it was my job to get it rolled out. So focused on CSPM, also focused on inventory, as we'll talk about why in a second. when you figure out which companies I've worked for, you'll realize that, come 2019, 2020, the mergers happened. And with those mergers became, okay, hey, you did a really good job at this one division, can you go make it happen everywhere else? And so I spent a lot of time at that point dealing with politics, dealing with convincing other teams that, hey, I'm just asking for an audit role here. Can you help me out? I didn't have the same level of goodwill with the other companies that I did with my first company. And of course, we all know COVID happens, everybody goes home. It became a lot harder to really kind of do that in-person influence that I had success doing. Hey, let's talk about that audit role. Let's talk about, hey, do we want to change CloudTrail? New job, who this, ended up going to a different company. Completely different company, kind of replicating the process there. That worked pretty well, but we did the same basic things, inventory baselines, cloud security posture monitoring. Got a little bit burnt out when that company started to go through its merger cycle, jumped back to IC, spent some time doing cloud governance, which is not, I think, what you all would think of as cloud governance, but it was what we considered governance, which was, hey, how do we keep the costs down? That was what the governance team really cared about. And then, jumped in, and now I'm building another program. So first incident that I had was sort of this one. Late one night, right before a Halloween party, boss sends me these tweets and said, hey, do you know what's going on here? And I'm like, I don't know. So that quickly led us to realizing that the first problem that we had to solve is, what the heck did we even have? So my immediate tasks when I started was identify our cloud accounts. We hadn't even put them all into consolidated billing. So what did we have? Then who owns this account? And when we say who owns this account, we really want to look at it from two perspectives. Who is the technical person who's in there making changes all the time? Who's the business owner who can actually make decisions about this account and owns the budget and owns everything else for that? We needed to fix all the issues in the CSPM. It was generating hundreds of CIS findings for metric groups, and none of that was remotely useful for the teams. But we had started getting into the, we should need to close these issues. We found them, we need to close them. First thing I did there was basically rewrite the CIS benchmarks to actually apply to what we did. And so we built our first cloud security standard and got that ratified, and we focused it on what mattered for us, which very much was, okay, let's look at edge security. Let's look at, moving off of IAM users to the solution that we had corporate-wide. It was very specific to the company at the time. And I used my time that I had been in the DevOps world with our developers and with our cloud engineers to sort of explain to them what we were doing. I had some credibility coming in, having not been in security. So I used that credibility to kind of move the program forward. So CloudSec is hard. When I first saw this image, I thought it was a joke. So it's the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's landscape. And probably half these companies are out on the show floor, right? But every one of these is a different way of doing some part of cloud native computing. In the media space, we have a lot of brands. And each brand pretty much had their own engineering team. And each engineering team had their own, pick up one of these off of the bingo card, set of, different technologies they used. So each tech team chose their own random pile of, services from this diagram. And they, of course, insisted that, their mix was the only mix that would work for their brand. So one cloud security architect, supporting 30+ brands, You know, if there were 15 ways to do CI/CD, I think we figured out 23 of them. Also didn't help that, you know, AWS and the other cloud providers were a global haystack. So, you know, back then, 14 regions, there's now 24, or maybe more, actually. You know, we had 115 accounts. So, you know, that's 1,600 places our security operations center had to go look. And when you start talking about like that S3 bucket problem, you know, not great. And then complexity of the cloud. So this is a diagram that I like to put in almost all of my presentations when I want to shame Amazon, because they make it so hard for us to understand what's going on. You know, between 2015 and 2018, they doubled the complexity. They've probably doubled it again since then. You know, we were a small security team. I was the one cloud security person, and I had to keep up with all of that. Which goes to my, you know, first rant of the day, which is shared responsibility is a failed model when the rate of change is so great that companies can't keep up, and they cannot understand and responsibly use those cloud services. So this is the hill I'm going to die on, especially when Amazon catches wind of it. So, you know, Lena Khan, if you're listening, this is where we need to be focused. Of course, I've talked a lot about Amazon. We were about 90% of us were 90% of our cloud, 90% of our spend was AWS. But you know, we had some Azure, we had some Google, and so, you know, every one of those clouds is different. And so when I was spending time in AWS, I was not spending time in Azure. I was not diving deep into the nuances of how VPCs work differently in Google than they do in AWS. Why do we use them? Nobody's stopped to consider what we had to do to actually operationalize them. They just were like, oh, hey, look, we're going to go do BigQuery. Or, oh, hey, look, you know, we've got some .NET databases. Let's just put them in Azure. It's teams going out and doing it without asking. You know, P cards are dangerous. Case in point, you know, so here's me in the last few months saying I need to go spin up a database, managed database in a Google Cloud project. Unlike AWS, where, oh, hey, it's just a network interface that sits in my VPC. In Google, oh no, they spin up their own VPC to run my database, and now I'm peering between the two. Now, probably that is completely safe for me to do. But how much time was I going to take into researching, okay, you know, what else is in this VPC? How is the multi-tenancy going? All of that. Final question that comes out is, what the heck is the cloud anyway? You know, we know it's somebody else's computer, but we in the security community haven't really defined what we mean. I've seen people say that they're cloud experts, and all they do is containers in a data center. At one point, I stopped working on infrastructure as a service security because somebody said, oh, we need a DLP program. We bought this CASB. The C in CASB stands for cloud, so give it to Ferris. That was sort of the politics phase of everything. All right, so what worked? Enough whining on that. First thing that I think really worked well is we got in some custom cloud standards. We didn't blindly adopt our CSPM findings as authoritative. We focused on what our risk was, which was not regulatory risk. It was content theft, PII theft, crypto miners, you know, that kind of thing. Crypto miners are great, by the way. I loved it when one of my accounts got popped by a crypto miner because it was a great object lesson to the company that had minimal collateral damage. So back in the 2017, 2018, when we got hit with a crypto miner, it It was a great way for us to exercise our cloud incident response process. It forced the company to go out and talk to the business and explain what was going on. Sometimes Amazon gave us credit, sometimes not, but it was an inexpensive way to really, understand these threats as they were coming in. But back to the cloud standards. It was written to be explicit for the developers. I didn't want it to be a jargony document. I wanted it to be something approachable. I wanted it to explain to everybody, you can't have 3389 open to the world. You can't have 22 open to the world. You can't have RDS database with a public IP address. Simple, basic statements that were easy enough for anybody to interpret. I took an opinion. All of the CIS CloudWatch metric filters, scratch all of that. Got rid of that, took it out of the baseline, took it out of the CSPM tool, cleaned up 1,500 findings in an hour. It was great. And why could we do that? Because we were feeding our CloudTrail into the SIM. So we didn't need any of those alerts that CIS recommended for the one-off person who may have one account and who wasn't necessarily an enterprise. Speaking of feeding your SOC, we immediately started putting all of that data into Splunk. And that was great because that was what our security operations team knew. But we used CloudTrail, GuardDuty. We brought in all of the AWS account information and all of the IP information. So it was super easy whenever we had a investigation to conduct of, okay, well, we've got this one RFC 1918 address. Who does it belong to? Where is it? Which cloud? What's it attached to? Spend is a great indicator of compromise. So, we'll get the billing information in, and if we see any kind of, anomalous spikes, follow up with the account teams. That was a great way for me to reach out and say, hey, so, what all you doing? Oh, hey, look, you're working on Redshift. Let's talk about how we do that right. With our SOC, we trained them, or at least in my first SOC, we really had trainings. We had lunch and learns. I explained CloudTrail, went through what cloud is, the differences between IAM, what an AKIA is and an ASIA, and what a Google credential looks like. So they had this context. And that was great because they understood then how cloud worked. They understood what we were doing as a business in the cloud. Unfortunately, that doesn't work with an outsourced SOC. And when I did have an outsourced SOC, the detect and response function was dismal. At one point, all they were doing is acting as a glorified step function of taking a GuardDuty or other alert, emailing the account owner and saying, hey, did you do this? No other investigative activity. So talking about inventory, we did it for all of our accounts. We put it all into our SIM. Again, RFC 1918 address comes in, we know where it is. We made sure every account had an executive, quote, an executive accountable to security and finance for all the activities in the account. And that was key because that was how we were able to gamify the CSPM scorecards that we built shortly thereafter. We forced teams to give us audit access into all of the accounts. That allowed us to collect all of the inventory. We eventually moved to getting break glass access in case of an incident, but that took a little bit more time. There was a trust that needed to be built up. This wasn't always universal, but where we had it, where we had a good, strong, centralized cloud engineering team, they were super great partners. They would deploy artifacts for us if we needed an audit role or we wanted to change the CloudTrail. We could work with them to, hey, we've got a better way of collecting this data that's going to be cheaper. How do we roll it out to all of the accounts at once? They often knew who the accountable executives were because they were the ones who were getting the tickets to create the new accounts. They did great work in making sure our federated identity system at the time was working. So we were getting rid of more and more IAM users, writing custom code to be able to give them CLI credentials off of our quasi-bespoke identity provider at the time. Again, this was back before AWS SSO, back before Okta was a great thing. And then they have good relationship with the developers. So if we had a question or if they caught wind of something going on that we should know about, they would let us know, and that was super helpful. So cloud provider tooling was another win. We turned on GuardDuty as soon as it was available. We used Macie for public bucket detection at one point. AWS IAM Access Analyzer was great. CloudTrail was great. These may not be the best of breed tools, but what was great about them was I could just turn them on. I didn't have to do a third-party risk review. I didn't have to go to procurement. I didn't have to have legal redline and MSA. Now, I say all of this, but don't turn on everything. Turn on what makes sense for your business. You turned on all the AWS security services, you're going to pay a lot of money, and maybe you don't need detective. Maybe you don't need AWS config. You probably don't need AWS config unless you're in Control Tower. So use the tools that you're ready to operationalize and hold off on the other stuff. Another great piece of this was, the fact that AWS organizations came around shortly thereafter, and it no longer even was having to configure it in every account. I could configure it once in every account. So as we started to mature, we got to the point where we started treating misconfigurations as incidents. And this was a little bit controversial because basically we were taking the work that the vulnerability management team was doing and giving it to the security operations team. And security operations team wasn't all that keen on that. So it was a hard sell, but then we were like, but we're talking about 3389 open onto the internet to a Windows machine. Security operations, do you want to deal with these or wait till the ransomware hits us? And as we articulated the risk, we got everybody on board with it. So it was no longer, hey, this thing is open, it's been attached to a Windows box for a long time because it comes through the vulnerability management program. No, the developer got a call from the SOC saying, hey, we saw you did that, wanted to make sure that your account wasn't compromised, with a CC to their vice president letting them know, hey, this happened, don't let it happen again. And then we started closing them ourselves because we had that break glass access. So we hadn't gotten to full auto remediation, but we were pretty close. All right, so what didn't work? Now, we'll prefix this also with, just because this didn't work doesn't mean it's not worth trying, but we'll start with service control policies and those sorts of things. Being in media, we didn't really have the ability to say, you can only do these certain things. I brought up a service control policy conversation and was immediately shut down by executives. They wanted to be able to do everything. And we did do everything. I would joke that the only thing we never used was IoT services, and then I logged in one day and I was like, oh look, there's $200,000 worth of IoT. Why? Because I wanted to use MQTT rather than SQS as a pub sub kind of tool. So for us, it was very hard to say, no, you can't use a service. No, you can't do this. We also got lots of pushback from developers who were like, well, we create our own VPCs and we need that ability and you can't take that away from us. And I'm like, really? How are you getting the IP addresses? Oh yeah, we talked to the network engineering team. The network engineering team that's building the VPCs for everybody else. Explain to me why you need you still need this and we can't put the service control policy out. Eventually we got to defining those security invariants that were never to be allowed by anybody other than, say, the network team. But service control policies aren't very flexible either. You can't have it say, okay, well, if the image is modified and the parameter is public, deny it. Those condition keys aren't always there. So we needed another layer of defense. Yes, tagging. So I've yet to see an organization that manages tags effectively. Now, when I started, we had somebody who said, well, we're going to have 5 accounts, because it's really hard to create VPCs. It's like 50 clicks in the AWS console to create a VPC. So we're going to have 5 accounts. 3 lines of business, corporate, and then 1 developer account. Meanwhile, I was over there with my own 5 accounts in a different department, managing things through IAC and building my VPCs that way. So of course, we put all of our business into these 5 accounts. And of course, we did a account migration, migration to the cloud, digital transformation, all of that stuff. But it was really more of a lift and shift. Except it really wasn't even a lift and shift. It was more like, hey, in the dark of night, throw a bunch of VMs on the back of a U-Haul and drag it up to the cloud and drop it there. And so the tagging basically was, hey, Joe the engineer who did the lift and shift was now the owner of the machine. Well, as soon as we needed to talk to anybody about that machine, Joe the engineer was like, oh, I don't know, own that. I just was working the ticket that moved that machine off of VMware and into AWS. So again, not super helpful. With tagging, what you're looking for are really 3 things. Compliance. Are the tags there? Do they meet the structure and form that you expect? Does the owner tag exist, and is it in the form of an email address? Conformant. So the tag exists, it's in the form of an email address, and that email address is actually within my own company. It's not somebody's personal email address. Or I've got a cost center, and that cost center actually exists in my ServiceNow or accounting system. And then accuracy. Are those tags accurate? Does the owner actually still work here? Is he still the owner? Is the tech contact still the person responsible for the infrastructure? Is she still working for the executive sponsor or not? So maintaining tagging is really just one aspect of this broader auto remediation story. So yes, we can talk about the allure of auto remediation. I think here, this is really popular because it's fast, and we really do need to be fast. We can't have some of these issues sticking around for hours or weeks. We did it when we made 3389 an incident rather than a vulnerability. But it's a tough nut to crack because you're now telling operations teams, yes, we're writing some code, and we're going to go have it run things in your production environment, and we probably won't go bad. So it can work, but the cultural bias is strong, pretty much because auto remediation is like nuclear power. One accident, and nobody ever wants to do it again. So this trust takes time to build. Other controls are needed to catch the issues before auto remediation happens. And auto remediation, again, is only useful in some cases. The last thing you want to do is auto remediate a problem with the database by deleting your database. So I've kind of been thinking about this auto remediation thing for a couple of years now. Kind of came up with 3 laws. So it should never actually delete any data in production. Nothing stateful should ever be harmed by a bot. The bot should actually secure the environment where it can, unless that violates the first law. And then the 3rd law is the bot must tell the carbon-based life form responsible for the misconfiguration that it fixed something. So we get to the pipeline excuse. If your engineers are telling you that we can't do bots because everything is done through IAC, go to the CloudTrail. You'll see the artisanal stuff they're doing. That was an easy, quick win for me to, kind of get around the reluctance to have bots running in accounts. Part of the solution to the no, everything's done by pipeline is to, well, put the checking and put the scanning into the pipeline. So IAC scanning is another thing that, is great on paper, but hard to do when you go back to that CNCF cloud native landscape and you've got all of that different technology. So again, 1-2 cloud security people can't build IAC scanning into 23 different kinds of pipelines. We needed to get the development team on board with that, and it was hard to do because they were still busy dealing with the CSPM issues. And what doesn't work is trying to force the issue. Again, developers are very particular on how they want to build these things, and saying, well, we should just have one CI/CD pipeline for the whole company wasn't going to fly. Nobody wanted to re-architect. Nobody wanted to move from their Pulumi to their CloudFormation or from their Terraform to Pulumi or CDK. So you needed to make it their idea. You need to give it to them as a way to offer it as a path out, and I'll show how all of this kind of comes together at the end. And then, honestly, I don't know if we really should have cloud security teams at all. You're taking all of the cloud security knowledge in the company, you're bottling it up into one group, and what are they doing? They're sitting in their ivory towers, flinging spreadsheets and requirements out into the masses, but they're not really solving the problems or feeling the pain of solving the problems. One of the things that I discovered when I moved into the cloud governance realm is, oh, hey, these are a lot harder to fix than I thought. So it's probably an unpopular opinion because CISOs like having that cloud security team. It's a piece of credibility and everything else, but maybe you really don't want to centralize it all. Waste of time. All right, so we'll start, really upsetting the vendors in the room. We'll start with policy requirements to appease others. So my path went from, hey, we had this thing, we were burning down a lot of risk, we were doing some good things, and then we got bought. And we got bought by a company with a very different security culture. Their policies look like that. Our cloud policy was, written in an afternoon by me. Our risk models were very different. We cared about Russians disrupting news broadcasts or thieves getting our content. They were terrified of regulators telling them they couldn't do anything. So while one of our successes really was being focused on our risk model, one of my failures was drifting from that and trying to appease and culturally fit into somebody else's risk model just because we had been acquired. So imposter syndrome is real. All right, CSPM. CSPM, I thought, after thinking about it, was a waste of time. At least how it's done in a VM function. We ended up creating massive spreadsheets. We sent the spreadsheets around with all of the other CVEs and findings and AppSec and everything else. At the start, we really started making some progress here. We got a lot of public buckets closed. We found a lot of old IAM access keys that were easily able to be deleted, deactivated, turned off. It was great. But once we got through the meaningful risk, the stuff that the developers understood was bad, we just had a pile of stuff left over that nobody wanted to touch. And it was really hard to find the last bits of high risk in the sea of unencrypted snapshots or IAM users that were doing legitimate things and we hadn't yet moved over. So the biggest problem that this came up with is when something like IMDS v2 came along and we had a new capability that we wanted to roll out because it was meaningful, we got pushback for adding it into the CSPM because they were like, oh, we're still working on these other things and now you want to add another 1,500 problems to our plate. No. I found this one recently, this tweet from Googler, from a Googler on why we still obsess over CSPM 10 years later. And I think it's really because, it's easy for us in security to go deploy a tool and find a bunch of problems. And there's somebody else's problems to go fix. I think CSPM is probably the last thing we should be doing, but it's easy, so we make it the first thing. So my journey of self-awareness, I started as a cloud engineer. I really got into the, hey, this is great. I can do IAC. Moved into the cloud security architect role. I made baselines. I made new friends. Figured out that accountability of who owns an account is really important. Moving into that 2019, 2020 frame, really discovered when I started working with the other companies, the strength of your cloud engineering team is key. I had one team that didn't exist, and so I was talking to accounting to get access to organizational payer accounts. I had another team that hadn't turned on organizations, so they were like, yeah, you need to go talk to the 300 account owners to get that done. Not helpful. Definitely discovered that tagging was overrated, especially once you get into a multi-account structure, because you have the accountability, and that bubble of accountability is on your AWS account. Moved into the new job, realized that leadership is really, really important. If you don't have a strong leader that can get buy-in from developers and just acts as kind of a tin horn dictator, then you've got you're going to have a harder time getting buy-in. And that's also when I realized that CSPM is a tar pit. Okay, so what should we do better? What were the mistakes? How do we not make them again? As Steve Ballmer once said, developers, developers, developers. No amount of Wiz, service control policies, cloud custodian can make up for an informed developer taking the extra time not to put an asterisk in their IAM policy in Terraform. Your ultimate shift left security flex is to educate and empower your developers. So if you take away nothing else from this, it's talk to your developers, get them on board, explain to them and articulate to the risk to them, because no vendor here is going to sell you this. How does this all kind of work together, all right? All the way over on the left, you've got your educated developers. They're not making the mistakes. They know better. They know that, hey, I need to put an extra story point into this because I'm going to do something very complex that's going to require me to take more time to do IAM. As we move to the right, this is where we integrate and we do threat modeling. This is where we do lunch and learns and talk about later cloud or other security threats. I find that the book Sandworm is a great way to get people into the idea of thinking about, okay, this is actually serious and can impact me. And so it was the one tax accountant in Kiev or Odessa who caused MERS to go down. That's a great object lesson for developers. And the book was greatly entertaining. Once you've done that people part, now you can start moving into the technology side. So start thinking about IAC scanning. And where you've got developers with pipelines, get them to put that in. Work with them on the IAC scanning for, okay, these are the things that we want you to fix, and these are the things that, eventually they may become a problem later, but you can go to production if you need to with these problems still in place. And followed right on that is prevention. How do you put in these service control policies or whatever to prevent the thing from ever happening, even if the developers or the account owners have full access to their environment. After that, you're now in production. So once you've gotten past those 4 lines of defense, you need a bot to auto-remediate it. And it may be that the IAC scanning didn't prevent it because they were doing ClickOps. We all want to be fully IAC, and we all tell everybody be fully IAC, but let's face it, we're not. And we will jump into the console to take care of something simple at some point. So auto-remediation then is there to be that last line of defense. And then you can get into the spreadsheets. Then you can get into the vulnerability management. But by the time you've got that spreadsheet there, it's very simple tasks. Or things that are very complex to resolve, like, hey, this RDS database isn't encrypted. And then you've got a smaller piece of things to look at the risk acceptance process, et cetera. Where to go through here? So don't throw out your CSPM. I talked a lot about how I hate them and they're horrible, but they're useful for getting that one bit of intelligence on what your posture looks like. They're critical, but keep that data to yourself. Don't let it become a compliance project. Don't let it become a gamification. You'll get distracted from actually doing the thing. And then embrace your developers. Treat them as allies. Our motto here, right, this year, we're stronger together. The developers are key to that. If you have to, you make compliance or internal audit or the Russians, the enemy. But as security, we want to be partners to them. It's a lot better to say, we don't want a publicly writable S3 bucket because we don't want to be serving Magecart to our viewers than it is to go back and say, well, section 24601 of the Information Classification Standard states that only authorized data owners are allowed to create their data records. So again, articulate the risk, make sure you sound like, you know what you're saying, that it doesn't sound ridiculous when you say it, that your developers can absorb the message. And with that, I will take questions. Or not, because I think we're out of time, right? Okay. Oh, we do have time. Oh, I was rushing. Sorry. Any questions?
Yes, yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, there are 2 microphones here. You can use any one of them.
So typically, your InfoSec team is going to be responsible for deploying a CSPM solution. Getting back to your point of trying to make it a cloud security company's responsibility instead of having a cloud security team, how do you strike that balance of like who's looking in the CSPM and delegating issues to your developers and your DevOps folks?
So a lot of that bubble of accountability comes down to the account. So the cloud engineering team was actually deploying the CSPM for us. Every time they created a new account, when they handed it over to the account owners, it was compliant at handover. So it had the CSPM, it had CloudTrail, it had all the necessary roles for whatever. Identity Federation was all set up. And then it really was anything in that account went to that executive. And the executives had multiple accounts, maybe different tech owners for different parts of their organization. But it was really the cloud engineering team that deployed the CSPM, and then the bubble of accountability was at that tenant level, whether it was an account subscription project.
Any other questions? Yeah? No?
Cool.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.